When the morning of 9 September 1087 broke over the Norman city of Rouen, the air inside the priory of St. Gervais was thick with the smell of incense, sweat, and something far more troubling. William I of England, known across Europe as William the Conqueror, lay dying. The most powerful ruler in Western Christendom had spent the night groaning in agony, his body swollen and blistered from injuries suffered weeks earlier. As priests whispered prayers and attendants tried to ease his pain, none could imagine that the greatest humiliation of his life was still ahead. What took place after his death would become one of the most disturbing episodes in medieval royal history. A grim story that echoed across Europe for centuries and cast a haunting shadow over the legacy of the man who had reshaped England forever. This is the beginning of the horrifying fate of William the Conqueror's remains. To understand why his end became so grotesque, we must go back to the summer of 1087, when William, now in his late 50s, launched one final campaign. Despite being overweight and plagued by years of illness, he marched into the Vexin region of France, intent on punishing King Philip I for an insult. Philip had mocked William's size, joking that the once fearsome conqueror had grown so fat he resembled a pregnant woman. In a world where royal power depended heavily on reputation, such words could not be ignored. William responded by ordering a brutal campaign of burning and destruction across the French borderlands. But during this military operation, the king's life took a sudden turn. While riding through the ruins of the sacked town of Mantes, his horse stumbled on smouldering rubble. The saddle drove violently into William's abdomen, rupturing internal organs. Medieval chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury later wrote that the injury worsened over the coming weeks, causing his stomach to swell, fill with gas, and become excruciatingly painful. This internal rupture would ultimately be the cause of his slow and agonizing death. He was carried to Rouen and laid in a modest chamber rather than a grand hall. The conqueror who had dominated England reshaped its laws, built monumental castles, and crushed rebellions now lay helpless. Priests were summoned to hear his confessions. Word spread quickly across Normandy and England, bringing lords, clergy, and officials to the city. Yet the atmosphere around the king's bedside was not one of unity or grief. Instead, it was filled with fear and calculation. William's sons were already preparing for the struggle over succession. Courtiers were thinking of their estates and political futures, and William himself seemed to know the end was near. On 9 September, his breathing weakened. The priests around him recited prayers and tried to provide comfort. Chroniclers record his final moments as solemn and remorseful. He confessed to acts of cruelty, admitted he had wronged many, and attempted to absolve himself of sins committed during the conquest of England. When he finally died, witnesses described a moment of silence followed by a sudden rush. The conqueror's attendants, fearing for their own safety and uncertain of what would happen next, abandoned the body almost immediately. Some looted the room, taking valuables, clothes, and even the king's personal possessions. Within minutes, the most powerful ruler in Europe was left alone on his deathbed. This abandonment marked the beginning of the disastrous fate that awaited his remains. Medieval kings were supposed to be honored with elaborate funerals, guarded by loyal attendants, and escorted with dignity to their burial place. But William's death revealed how unstable his empire truly was. His eldest son Robert wanted Normandy. His second surviving son William Rufus wanted England. Each raced to secure their claims, leaving no one to tend to the dead king. The servants who normally handled royal funerals scattered. The clergy, who should have organized the ceremony, struggled to maintain order. Days passed without a proper plan for transportation or burial. Eventually, a small group of clergy decided the king must be taken to St. Stephen's Abbey in Caen, the great Norman monastery that William himself had founded years earlier. But even this journey was plagued by misfortune. First, the city of Rouen caught fire shortly after his death. Flames engulfed parts of the city. forcing the king's body to remain unburied longer than acceptable for a corpse already suffering from severe internal injuries. Historians believe his abdomen, ruptured weeks earlier, was steadily decomposing. Temperatures were warm, time was passing, and medieval embalming practices were crude. When preparations finally began, monks attempted to wash and prepare his remains. But decomposition had already advanced. Chroniclers describe the body as swollen and difficult to manage. Despite these problems, they wrapped him in funerary cloths and decided to transport him to Caen, a journey of several days. They secured a wooden coffin and organized a minimal procession. Without the presence of his sons or major nobles, it was a stark contrast to the kind of funeral expected for a king who had reshaped England and Normandy. The journey itself became another part of the tragedy. Transporting a decaying body on horseback and rough roads produced an overpowering stench, noticeable to everyone nearby. The monks accompanying the corpse struggled to keep insects away and maintain dignity. Some accounts mention that townspeople along the route recoiled at the sight and smell, unsure whether the figure inside the coffin was truly the once mighty William the Conqueror. When the procession finally reached Caen, new problems arose. During the funeral service at St. Stephen's Abbey, an unexpected interruption occurred. As the clergy prepared to lower the coffin into the tomb William had constructed for himself, a local man named Selin stepped forward. He loudly claimed that the land upon which the abbey stood had been stolen from his father by William years earlier. According to chroniclers, Selin demanded compensation before the burial could continue. The scene shocked the attendees. The reputation of William as a conqueror with a complex and violent past was suddenly on full display in his final moments. The clergy had no choice but to negotiate. They paid Selin compensation so the burial could proceed. Only after settling the dispute did they resume the ceremony, but the worst was yet to come. As the monks attempted to place William's swollen corpse into the stone tomb, they realized something terrible. The coffin was too small. This miscalculation, likely caused by haste and poor preparation, led to an infamous moment recorded by several medieval writers. When the monks tried to force the body into the tomb, the pressure caused the abdomen to rupture. The corpse burst open, releasing an overwhelming stench so foul that the entire church was said to have filled with nauseating fumes. Many attendants fled, priests gagged. The funeral descended into chaos. For a king who had dominated Europe, rewritten English society, and achieved unparalleled victories, this final humiliation was shocking, and yet it symbolized the contradictions of his rule. His death stripped away the fear and power that shielded him in life, exposing the divisions and disputes that had always existed beneath the surface of his reign. This horrifying fate of William the Conqueror's remains would become one of the most infamous medieval burial disasters in history. His funeral, meant to honor the founder of Norman England, became instead a lesson in human frailty, political instability, and the unpredictable turns of medieval life. It also revealed the deep tensions that his conquests had created, tensions that would shape the future of England, Normandy, and all of Western Europe. To understand why the horrifying fate of William the Conqueror's remains mattered so deeply, we must look beyond the shocking events of his funeral and examine the world he built, the political storms he left behind, and the tensions that exploded the moment he died. For William's decay in the church at Caen was not merely a physical incident. It was the symbolic unraveling of an empire held together by one man's will. The moment his breath stopped on 9 September 1087, the vast structure of power he had assembled began to fracture, and the fate of his corpse would come to mirror the fate of his dominion. William was born in 1028 as the illegitimate son of Duke Robert of Normandy and a tanner's daughter named Herliva. His surnames in early life included William the Bastard, a title often used by enemies and rivals to undermine his legitimacy, Yet William possessed a relentless determination. Even as a child, he survived assassination attempts, rebellions, and plots. Normandy was a violent land of warlords and competing nobles, and William learned early that leadership required brutal decisiveness. Every challenge strengthened him. Every rebellion he crushed deepened his authority. By the time he reached adulthood, he had tamed Normandy with a mixture of strategy, alliances, and uncompromising force. But the event that changed his life and the future of England forever came in 1066. When King Edward the Confessor of England died without an heir, William claimed that Edward had promised the throne to him, but the English nobles chose Harold Godwinson instead. William took this as a betrayal of both diplomatic promise and personal honor. What followed was one of the most decisive military invasions in medieval history. William crossed the English Channel with an army of Normans, Bretons, Flemings, and mercenaries. On 14 October 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William defeated and killed Harold, securing the throne by force. His rule over England was transformational. He reshaped the aristocracy by replacing Anglo-Saxon nobles with Norman lords loyal to him. He built monumental castles like the Tower of London and Windsor, symbols of Norman dominance. He commissioned the Domesday Book, a vast record of land ownership, taxation, and resources, which today remains one of the most important documents in medieval European history. But William's rule was also marked by violence and oppression. The Harrying of the North, a brutal campaign from 1069 to 1070, devastated northern England. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and thousands starved. Chroniclers describe the region as left in a state resembling wasteland. This was the cost of rebellion under William's iron hand. Despite the harshness, he established political stability. England became more centralized, with stronger royal authority than under previous Anglo-Saxon kings. But this stability depended entirely on William himself. He controlled both England and Normandy, ruling them as a dual realm. The moment he died, these territories were destined to split. His sons were rivals. His nobles were divided, and his long list of enemies saw opportunity. William had 4 sons who survived into adulthood. The eldest, Robert, known as Robert Curthose, had long been a source of frustration. He was impatient, ambitious, and often rebellious. William had once refused to give him substantial power, leading Robert to lead a revolt against his own father. For years, their relationship was marked by distrust. William respected Robert's bravery in battle, but doubted his judgment and political ability. The second surviving son, William Rufus, was very different. He was stern, confident, and favored by many Norman barons. The youngest surviving son, Henry, was intelligent and politically shrewd, but with little inheritance. William's vast lands were too valuable and too unstable to pass peacefully to any single heir. On his deathbed in 1087, William made the fateful decision that would shape Europe for decades. He granted Normandy to Robert and England to William Rufus. Henry received money but no land. This division created a dangerous imbalance. Normandy and England had been united under one ruler for 21 years. Splitting them revived old rivalries and created new ones. Nobles who held land in both territories found themselves torn between competing loyalties. The brothers themselves were rivals by nature. Thus, when William died, power shattered instantly. Robert rushed from Rouen to claim his position in Normandy. William Rufus hurried to England, seizing the treasury and declaring himself king. Henry waited, watching for opportunities to advance his own ambitions. The Norman realm, once held firmly in William's grasp, now became a battleground. Meanwhile, William's corpse lay abandoned. This abandonment was not simply a result of fear or superstition. It reflected the power vacuum that opened immediately upon his death. Royal funerals required resources, authority, and organized leadership. But no one was in charge. His sons were too busy securing crowns to worry about his body. Nobles had no leader to obey. Clergy lacked the direction and protection needed to carry out a royal burial. Even in death, the king's body became caught in political crossfire. The fire that broke out in Rouen just after his death delayed preparations. Some saw this as divine judgment, others blamed it on the chaos caused by his passing. The monks who eventually organized the funeral lacked the manpower and noble presence expected for such a ceremony. The journey to Caen lacked grandeur. There was no royal escort, no military display, no gathering of powerful lords to honor the deceased conqueror. The dispute in the church at Caen, where a Celan demanded compensation for land once seized by William, further reveals how fragile the king's authority became once he was gone. In life, no one would have dared confront William so boldly. In death, however, all grievances came to the surface. It was a moment where the unfinished conflicts of William's reign erupted into public view. The conqueror's power had silenced countless enemies, but death removed the silence. The final humiliation, when his body burst during attempts to place him in the tomb, carried symbolic weight. Chroniclers describe the stench filling the church, forcing priests and mourners to retreat. Over time, this moment became a dark legend, repeated across Europe as a cautionary story about pride, mortality, and divine judgment. Whether or not the details were exaggerated, the event reflected a deeper truth. William's empire, like his body, had expanded beyond its limits, and now, under pressure, it ruptured. While the physical disaster of his burial shocked contemporaries, the political consequences of his death were far more significant. England under William Rufus faced immediate challenges. The new king struggled to gain the loyalty of barons loyal to Robert. Several powerful nobles launched a rebellion in 1088 to replace William Rufus with his elder brother. The rebellion ultimately failed, but it revealed how divided the realm had become. Robert's rule in Normandy was weak and inconsistent. He lacked the discipline and strategic brilliance of his father. Nobles exploited his indecisiveness, leading to frequent conflicts and disorder. Henry, the youngest brother, maneuvered carefully. He sought opportunities to gain land and influence. Over the following years, he would rise unexpectedly to the throne of England in 1100, after William Rufus died in a mysterious hunting accident. Many suspected foul play, but medieval politics often blurred the line between accident and intent. Henry seized the moment, took control of the treasury, and became Henry I of England. He later invaded Normandy, capturing Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106. With Robert imprisoned for life, Henry reunited England and Normandy once more. Yet even this reunion was temporary. Henry's death reopened the same conflicts, leading eventually to the loss of Normandy under King John in 1204. Thus, William's legacy became entangled in generations of rivalry, conflict, and political upheaval. The world he built did not endure in the form he intended. His death exposed the unstable foundations of his empire. His sons fought over his territories, nobles rebelled, loyalties fractured, and his burial disaster became the perfect metaphor for the collapse of the order he had imposed with such force. By the end of the 12th century, the tomb in Caen where William had been buried fell into neglect. Wars, fires, and religious upheaval damaged it repeatedly. His bones were moved, lost, stolen, and scattered across centuries. The great conqueror who once commanded armies now became a fragmentary relic of the past. The horrifying fate of William the Conqueror's remains was not merely a grotesque footnote in medieval history. It was the breaking point of a fragile political world he had spent decades building. The chaos surrounding his death and burial revealed deep fractures in the societies he ruled, fractures that would widen into conflicts, rebellions, and transformations that reshaped England and Normandy for generations. To truly understand the importance of this event, we must explore how the destruction of William's body symbolized the broader disintegration of his carefully constructed empire. This is the story of how a decaying corpse became the symbol of a shifting world. The death of a king in medieval Europe was always a moment of danger. Royal power depended on continuity. If a succession was not immediate and uncontested, the realm risked falling into civil war. But William's rule had been particularly complex. He was not merely the King of England or the Duke of Normandy. He was the ruler of two distinct societies with different cultures, laws, and political traditions. England was a centralized monarchy with a long Anglo-Saxon administrative heritage. Normandy was a feudal duchy defined by personal bonds and local authority. William held these realms together by sheer force of will. He was the central pillar. Remove the pillar, and the structure trembled. From the moment William died in 1087, the tremors began. His sons inherited lands, but not his authority. Robert Curthose, who took Normandy, lacked discipline. He was generous to a fault, easily manipulated, and often distracted. In contrast, William Rufus, who inherited England, was forceful, cunning, and politically aggressive. Neither possessed the unique combination of military skill, administrative command, and personal dominance that had allowed their father to control both territories. As soon as William Rufus claimed the English throne, rebellion erupted. Many Norman barons held lands on both sides of the Channel, and they believed the realms should remain united under one ruler. They supported Robert and plotted to overthrow William Rufus. The rebellion of 1088 became the first great crisis of William's legacy. Led by powerful nobles such as Odo of Bayeux, the conspirators coordinated an uprising that spread across southern England. Their goal was to depose William Rufus and place Robert on the English throne, thereby reuniting the kingdoms. The rebellion, though fierce, ultimately failed. William Rufus gathered forces loyal to him, issued promises of reform, and defeated the rebels. But the conflict revealed the fundamental instability William had left behind. Divided rule was unsustainable. Nobles played one king against the other. Brothers who should have cooperated became rivals. And the realm remained unsettled for decades. Meanwhile, Robert's rule in Normandy began to crumble. He lacked his father's ability to maintain order among the fractious Norman nobility. Banditry increased. Local lords expanded their power. Financial mismanagement weakened the duchy. Normandy, once a disciplined and formidable military power under William, began to drift into confusion. Robert squandered resources, often leaving his duchy vulnerable to rivals. The situation worsened when Robert joined the First Crusade in 1096. Unable to fund his journey, he mortgaged Normandy to William Rufus for a large sum of money. This gave the English king temporary control over the duchy, strengthening England, but destabilizing Normandy even further. It also demonstrated the extent to which Robert was willing to compromise the security of his region for personal ambition. The crusade brought him glory abroad, but chaos at home. When William Rufus died in 1001 during a hunting accident in the New Forest, suspicion immediately fell on his younger brother Henry. Although the death may well have been accidental, medieval people often saw political convenience as evidence of guilt. Henry moved quickly. He seized the treasury at Winchester, took control of key fortresses, and was crowned King Henry I within days. His decisive actions prevented another succession crisis, but they did not stop future conflict. Robert returned from the crusade in 1001 to challenge Henry for the English throne. Their armies faced one another at Alton, but a negotiated settlement prevented bloodshed. Still, tensions remained unresolved. Henry manipulated Norman politics, supporting rebellious nobles to weaken Robert's rule. In 1106, at the Battle of Tinchebray, Henry defeated his brother and captured him. Robert spent the rest of his life imprisoned. With this victory, Henry reunited England and Normandy under a single ruler once more. Yet even Henry could not overcome the long-term consequences of William's divided succession. His only legitimate male heir, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120. This tragedy reintroduced instability into the realm. After Henry's death in 1135, a civil war known as the Anarchy erupted between supporters of his daughter Matilda and her cousin Stephen of Blois. For nearly 20 years, England descended into chaos, marked by castle warfare, shifting allegiances, and suffering among the common people. The roots of this turmoil lay in William's decision in 1087 to divide his lands. That decision had created generations of rivalry and instability. The Conqueror had built an empire with his own hands, but without a stable succession plan, it fractured repeatedly. His sons struggled. His grandson died unexpectedly. The broader structure collapsed. Even after the anarchy ended in 1153 with the Treaty of Wallingford, the realm remained shaped by the echoes of William's reign. Henry Roman II, Matilda's son and the founder of the Angevin Empire, inherited a kingdom still bearing the scars of decades of dynastic conflict. His rule established a stronger monarchy, but England and Normandy remained entwined in a political relationship riddled with tensions created by William's earlier divisions. In the centuries that followed, the memory of William the Conqueror grew into legend. He became a symbol of Norman power, the founder of a new English aristocracy, and the architect of a strong centralized monarchy. But his physical remains told a different story. His bones did not rest in peace. Wars, religious upheavals, and political conflicts repeatedly disturbed his tomb. During the French Wars of Religion in the 16th century, Huguenot forces attacked Caen and desecrated the abbey. They broke the tomb, scattered the bones, and destroyed most of the Conqueror's remains. Only a single thigh bone was recovered, reburied, and placed in a new tomb. But even this tomb faced continued threats in later centuries. Fires, revolutions, and reconstruction all contributed to the loss of his physical legacy. The destruction of William's remains contrasts sharply with the monumental impact of his life. The king who had changed the identity of England, shaped medieval Europe, and imposed his will on nations could not even keep his bones intact. His body became a metaphor for political forces he unleashed but could not control. His realm fractured. His descendants fought, his remains disappeared, but his influence endured. The horrifying fate of William's body also became a moral lesson for medieval writers. Chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury saw meaning in the decay, rupture, and humiliation of a once mighty king. They interpreted it as divine commentary on pride, ambition, and the abuse of power. For them, the bursting of William's corpse was not just a physical event but a spiritual metaphor. It symbolized the limits of earthly authority and the certainty of death, no matter how powerful the individual. For England, the long-term consequences were profound. The Norman conquest permanently altered the English language, law, culture, and aristocracy. It introduced a feudal system that shaped medieval society for centuries. It transformed architecture through Romanesque churches and stone castles. It established stronger royal administration. It connected England more deeply to European politics. But it also introduced centuries of tension between England and France, tensions that would eventually lead to the 100 Years' War. Thus, the fate of William's body cannot be separated from the fate of the realm he built. His physical decay, burial chaos, and eventual disintegration mirrored the instability and fragmentation of his empire. His death exposed the fragility of power, the dangers of dynasty, and the unpredictable consequences of conquest. Yet, despite the grim details of his end, William remains one of the most influential rulers in English history. His legacy extends far beyond his corpse. It lives in the institutions he created, the families he elevated, and the history he reshaped. But the story of his remains one of the most disturbing reminders of how even the greatest figures of history cannot escape the forces of decay and the judgment of time. Centuries after the horrifying events of William the Conqueror's funeral, the stench that filled the church of St. Stephen in Caen faded into legend. Yet the story of his remains lived on as one of the most unsettling royal burials in medieval history. But the deeper truth of William's legacy lies not only in how his corpse was treated, but in how his memory endured, changed, and influenced the world long after his bones were scattered. To conclude this historical account, we must explore the long afterlife of William the Conqueror, the ways in which his image transformed across generations, and how the grim fate of his remains became intertwined with the rise and evolution of medieval Europe. This final section examines how William's impact lived on far beyond his death, shaping nations and identities long after his physical body was destroyed. In the centuries following William's death in 1087, England and Normandy continued to develop in directions he had set in motion, but could not fully control. His descendants inherited not just lands, but a system of governance that still bore his imprint. Norman castles towered over English towns. Norman French blended with Old English to create a new linguistic landscape. The Domesday Book preserved the economic structure of late 11th century England with an accuracy unprecedented for the time. And yet William's memory remained complex, feared by some, admired by others, debated by scholars, chroniclers, and rulers alike. One of the most enduring aspects of his legacy was the transformation of the English aristocracy. Before 1066, England had been ruled by powerful Anglo-Saxon families. After the Norman conquest, those families were largely replaced by Norman barons loyal to William. Their descendants would dominate English politics for generations. These new lords controlled estates, castles, and legal authority. They introduced a continental style of governance that included feudal obligations, knight service, and a more structured hierarchy rooted in loyalty to the crown. This shift in aristocracy fundamentally changed the social fabric of England. With new lords came new customs. Norman culture gradually blended with Anglo-Saxon traditions, creating a hybrid identity that formed the basis of medieval English society. The English language, once entirely Germanic in structure, absorbed thousands of French words over the following centuries. Legal concepts, architectural styles, and forms of military organization were all shaped by William's conquest. Even today, English contains a dual vocabulary where many legal and administrative terms have Norman French origins. Yet William's legacy was not uniformly positive. His brutal suppression of northern England during the harrying of the North left scars for generations. The devastation was so severe that some lands recorded in the Domesday Book in 1086 remained described as waste. Chroniclers continued to debate whether William's cruelty was justified or excessive. For some, he was a strong ruler who brought order. For others, he was a conqueror who destroyed too much in his pursuit of control. The symbolism of his burial disaster grew in medieval interpretation. Many saw divine judgment in the bursting of his corpse during the funeral at Caen. In a deeply religious age, physical decay was often linked to moral decay. Chroniclers used the event to teach lessons about power, pride, and mortality. They argued that no matter how great William had been in life, death humbled him completely. His humiliation became a warning to future kings that even the most successful ruler could not escape the consequences of earthly actions. Over the centuries, William's tomb underwent repeated trauma. In the 12th and 13th centuries, political instability led to further disruptions of royal resting places across Normandy. But the real destruction came during the French wars of religion in the 16th century. Protestant Huguenots, seeking to punish symbols of Catholic and monastic power, stormed the abbey at Caen in 1562. They broke open William's tomb, scattering the remains of the conqueror. Most of his bones were lost forever, either destroyed, taken as relics, or simply ground into dust. Only a single thigh bone was preserved. It was placed in a small box and reburied in a new tomb during the 17th century. This partial survival is a stark metaphor for William's legacy. The physical king was gone, fragmented beyond recognition. But his influence endured. The English monarchy continued to evolve along lines he had established. Norman legal principles helped shape the foundations of what would later become the English common law system. The Norman emphasis on record-keeping influenced centuries of administrative development, and the cultural changes he introduced contributed to the formation of a uniquely English identity that blended Anglo-Saxon resilience with Norman martial discipline. In the later Middle Ages, William's image shifted once more. English chroniclers, especially those writing during the 100 Years' War, looked back on the conqueror with national pride. As England and France fought bitterly over territory, kings and nobles on both sides invoked the memory of William. For the English, he was the founder of their medieval greatness. For the French, he was a reminder that Normandy had once produced rulers capable of dominating kingdoms across the sea. By the Renaissance, historians began studying William with more critical scholarship. They examined the Domesday Book, analyzed chronicles, and debated his motives. The story of his death and disintegration continued to fascinate scholars. Writers saw in his fate a powerful reminder of the medieval world view, that all earthly power is temporary, and that even the greatest kings return to dust. But they also understood William as a transformative figure, one whose political and cultural impact could not be reduced to the manner of his death. In the modern era, William the Conqueror remains a central figure in the study of medieval Europe. His invasion of England in 1066 is often considered one of the most important turning points in the history of the British Isles. Historians continue to debate his policies, his personality, and his long-term impact. Some argue that he brought stability and order to a fractured kingdom. Others emphasize the violent consequences of his rule. But nearly all agree that William reshaped the course of English history more than almost any other ruler. What makes the story of his remains so compelling is not simply its grotesque detail, but its symbolic meaning. His death exposed the fragility of medieval kingship. His burial reflected the political divisions he left behind. His decomposition mirrored the gradual fragmentation of his empire, and the destruction of his bones centuries later symbolized the erosion of the world he built, swept away by new wars, new conflicts, and new historical forces. Yet William's influence survived all of this. He lives on in the landscape of England, where countless Norman churches, cathedrals, and castles still stand. He lives on in the English language, shaped by the fusion of cultures he initiated. He lives on in the legal and governmental systems that developed from the institutions he established. He lives on in historical memory as a figure of immense complexity, a conqueror, a king, a reformer, and a ruthless ruler whose death was as dramatic as his life. By the 19th century, archaeologists and historians made renewed efforts to preserve what little remained of William's tomb. During the French Revolution, the abbey once again faced destruction, but local clergy protected the tomb as best they could. In 1802, the surviving thigh bone was reburied in a new monument with an inscription marking the site as the resting place of William the Conqueror.